Good morning, everyone. Bright and early. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the Cities of Trauma panel, conversation, not using panel, conversation. And it's really exciting to be here with these three amazing writers who I'm going to introduce shortly. So we've got Alistair right at the end there, whose novel The Child came out April this year, and his written short fiction published in Commonwealth Writers, Ada Magazine, Brittle Paper, New Contrast, the Kalahari Review, Kabaka Magazine. I laughed at that, by the way, Kabaka Magazine, because there's an actual Kabaka in the world. And Penny, as well as the anthologies Queer Africa 2, The Other, and Queer Africa Selected Stories. And his debut novel, It Doesn't Have to Be This Way, was published in 2022. Next to him is Nick Mhlongo, whose first novel, Dog Eat Dog, was published in 2004 by Kwela and translated into Spanish. And besides writing novels and short stories, he's written a screenplay as well for TV series Magic Seller for children, and comics for comic magazine, script for comic magazine in Shana, which appeared in 2007. And The City Is Mine is his most recent novel. And Karen Jennings, sitting next to me, the author of 3 novels, Finding Soutbeck, Travels with My Father, and Upturned Earth, a short story collection. A short story collection, Away from the Dead, and a poetry volume, Space Inhabited by Echoes. I feel like I should make some disclaimers. So, Alistair, your book was like my travel companion. I took it everywhere with me from like the past few weeks, ever since I got it. Nick, yours was like my after work, okay, what is Mangi up to now? Kind of like transitioning from the end of work and into like, okay, what am I doing tonight? Because Mangi's life is just putting me through the most. And Karen, yours had me shook from start to finish. Like, I was shook. Like, I can still hear Deirdre's coughing. That's how shook I was by yours. So I think if anyone has already read these novels, they kind of sit with you and they live with you. And they kind of travel with you because there are these kind of very mobile characters and these stories that are constantly moving. But so we're going to start off with an extract. Everyone's going to read an extract, and then we'll get into conversation. Everyone wants to break the ice. Go ahead.
All right, sure. This is from fairly on in the novel. The main character has just returned to Cape Town from living in New York, and so quite a lot of things strike him afresh. The same homeless people sit on the corner, just as they did years ago. The old matriarch among them. She reigns from her upended plastic beer crate in an ankle-length skirt and thin beige cotton jersey. Her face is round and flat, skin the color of oak. She smiles at me as I walk past on my way to the supermarket. She has a collection of household items lined up on the red earth in front of her. 3 pairs of old shoes, 2 romance novels, a set of silver candelabras clouded black. I assume they were given to her by other pedestrians on their way to the shops, small items for her to sell. Beside her, sitting in the dirt, is a man with a deeply lined face and 2 younger women close to the curb, breaking off bits of baguette and feeding the crumbs to the pigeons. They watch me as I go by. Not one of them speaks. The car guards are more vocal, more pushy. They follow me for sections of the street, overly friendly, making their presence known. Everything's good, says the fresh-faced young man in a reflective yellow vest, falling into step beside me. Everything's fine. He peels away when I move beyond his kingdom and into the territory of the next car guard, who smiles at me and points to the cars as if to say, "You see, I protected yours." I try to appease them with a brief smile, but I'm determined not to give them any money, not when I don't have a car yet, and I plan to walk this route many times a week. "It's okay," says the car guard when he sees I'm not stopping to give him any cash. "You can get me something in the shops." It isn't a question, and I smile to make it feel less like a threat. I walk faster than is comfortable. I take a different route home on my way back from the shops, walking 3 blocks out of my way to avoid the car guards. But I feel even worse when I return to the corner where the homeless people sit. They don't ask me for anything. They look through me, through my bags laden with food and light bulbs and toiletries, into the distance, resigned to their role in this grotesque play. New York's poor didn't make me feel like this. I wasn't a symbol of privilege there. I wasn't a symbol of anything. I was ordinary or lower, an immigrant. There's wealth in New York that's unimaginable here, beyond the reaches of our middle class and even our elites. Learn to speak English, someone hissed at me once after I'd taken the trouble to give him directions, and I loved how it stung. I had to say my ideas 3 or 4 times at work before anyone heard them. They just assumed he's from Africa, he doesn't have good ideas. Our apartment was tiny. We stood in sweaty crowds on the hot subway platform, waiting for the same grubby trains as everyone else. I was pushed and ignored. I was no one worth following down the street. Beggars in Brooklyn elicited nothing in me but a clean, burning, uncomplicated sadness that made charity so easy. They had fallen on hard times, or the system had broken them, but it wasn't my system. It wasn't this system that gave me everything I have. Here, on Skunda Street, all I can think of is, I did this to you. My ancestors did this to you. And maybe beneath all the reasons white South Africans emigrate, the economic projections, the crime, the corruption, the considerations of the kids, is the simple urge to escape this feeling of culpability and complicity. I could give everything I own to these homeless women, to these car guards, and it wouldn't make a difference. It's a drop in the ocean, impotent against centuries of dispossession. There is no way to atone for this. My chest is tight when I get home, but I know it's not a heart attack. I've been told so many times by so many doctors that it's not a heart attack. My heart is fine for now. I try to force a few slow, deep breaths into my lungs. I install the light bulbs by candlelight. When I turn the power back on, the house is beautiful again, as I remember it, my forever home. It was the place I was going to raise a family, and my God, I need that now. A place to feel grounded and rooted and safe. A child to pour my love into, to protect and nurture. To help another human being grow instead of watching the world around me fall apart.
Oh, good morning. The bright morning sun slid gradually over the high iron gate of Ellis Park Stadium to throw narrow patterns of parallel shadows onto the ground before it. The Joburg heat filled the air in all its intensity. The breeze, which sprang up in the morning, had died away like a ghost returning to the grave. As the sun bent down, sweat stung my eyes, and I wiped it away on my shirt sleeves. At the corner of Byte and Nugget Street, a homeless person stood at the faulty traffic lights with a board that said, "Let's do lunch. You buy, we eat." His dirty shoes were falling apart and attached to his ankle with a dark string. I smiled at the man before spending a moment of exchanging banalities with him. His face radiated joy, and he had a cataracted eye. "My brother, how is life?" I asked. "It only takes time, but in the end, it will come together, my brother." He tada. As he smiled at me, rivulets of sweat ran down my back, and my shirt clung to my skin. Before the traffic lights, a motorist dropped a cigarette he was smoking on the ground. It lay burning faintly. The homeless man ran towards it, picked it up, and smoked whatever was left of it. In front of me, the city looked happy and loud, although there were signs of death, neglect, decay, and aging infrastructure everywhere. Nostalgia hit me as I crossed the railway line separating Hillbrow and the CBD. A black rubbish bag sailed from the train bridge into the line below from a hawker, and it burst up, scattering rubbish between the disused railway lines. Big fat rats scattered and then regrouped before foraging the teared bag. The deeper I penetrated the city, the more diverse the population. I strolled down the congested De Villiers Street, crossed Claim Street, and towards the MTN Newark taxi rank. I became acutely aware of rubbish on the street. The streets were filled with a world of languages. There were working men and thieves of various kinds. As I walked slowly, I might have heard all 11 South African languages and more than a dozen languages that I could not understand. In front of me, a young homeless man walked round the edge of a pile of rubbish. The oversized t-shirt that he was wearing made him look even thinner than he was. Time was passing with unbearable slowness. I sat down on the bench at the Joburg Park and watched people play chess using huge chess piece and the floor chessboard. The person I rooted for to win was unkempt, agitated man who appeared to be around 50. He had a bushy-like gray beard and hair. The way he posed before he moved his pieces triggered a flood of distant memories and emotions in me. His opponent was light-skinned with a pallid complexion. The front of his head was bald, whereas his back sprouted a thick tuft of hair. He'd bury his fist in his armpits before he made a move. He would then start biting his lower lip quite hard when he sensed that he had made a costly move. Small drops of sweat traveled down from his forehead, and he didn't wipe them away. The somber thoughts that had blinded me seemed to have vanished as I watched them play. I used to come to this place years ago when the park was clean and safe. I would sit in the same spot and watch people play chess, which was also one of my hobbies. Today, the park looked like a no-go area, especially at night. It was inhabited by thieves, prostitutes, and druggies who had populated the city. I was astounded by how old I felt. All those memories that were re-emerging from my past seemed to be shaping my present. My dirty beard, Joburg Park, the nearby Wanderers taxi rank, Park Station, the flats, they all created a vast emotional distance on which I could look back, and from time to time, I remembered with my eyes half closed. Joburg used to be my home. It had taught me a number of survival skills ever since I got mugged in this city a few years ago. Walking in this city center was like carrying my death on my shoulders. One must always watch out for pickpocketers, cell phone and bag snatchers. Always pretend you belong to the city. Since the day I was mugged, I had not reconciled with this city. I had an ongoing abusive relationship with Joburg, just like with Aza. As I continued walking, I became extra cautious. Today, Joburg streets are yours. Tomorrow, there's no guarantee. That's how disfigured this city was. It had been taken advantage of by the Tsotsis, and like its neglected, drug-addicted street kids, it has never regained its soul. It was in this city that I had met Aza and fell in love with her. For 8 years until now, she had constituted my whole universe, and together we had become ourselves. But ever since I got mugged, I look at this city with great suspicion, just like I look at Aza. I had come face to face with its reality, its mental, physical, and emotional poverty. No doubt, this city had turned me into a stranger, a foreigner in what used to be my home. Thank you.
I'll be reading to you from Crooked Seeds right near the beginning. This is set in the southern suburbs of Cape Town in an imagined very near future around 2028 when there's a massive water crisis. There basically is no water, so people have to queue for water. She could see the queue from where they stood. It ran 3 blocks deep, extended around the corner. 2 armed guards patrolled the outer edges. 1 more stood near the water truck and collection point. Beyond the truck, a traffic officer had parked his car, the lights flashing hotly in the morning gloom. He had put out cones, was directing the few vehicles that passed by. Passengers and drivers looked out at the queue, at the people with their array of containers in dressing gowns and slippers, wearing jackets and coats over their work clothes and school uniforms, a few wrapped in blankets against the cold. Someone was listening to the news on a cell phone. Elsewhere, music was playing. Most were using earphones though, intent on something beyond the slow, shifting wait. Few were interested in conversation. "How's it looking today?" she said. "Nothing special, same as always. I didn't see you yesterday." "You okay?" "Yeah, just wasn't in the mood for all this shit." He nodded. "Yeah, I know what you mean." She eyed the queue, saw a woman with a teenage daughter, the girl's arms crossed, the mother's too. They wore headscarves and long skirts. Behind them stood a man with his son and daughter. The man tapped his foot, leaned forward, and said something to the scarved woman. She shook her head, then took out her phone and showed him something on it, the light from the screen highlighting the darkness beneath her eyes. The man frowned, rubbed hard at his jaw in irritation. Deirdre had already taken a few steps towards the queue, but she came back now, said to Winston, "Give us a ciggy, hey? I'll get you back later." "When's later? I'm still waiting from last week and last month. Eish, man, I'm still waiting from last year." But he took one from his pocket, lit it, handed it across. She coughed wetly as she inhaled, then spat the wet out. "Ugh, man, don't be like that. One day I'm going to bring you a whole pack, okay? Like a whole pack. And not just any kind. It'll be the good kind. You'll see." "Yeah," he said. "I'm waiting."
So I love these extracts. I didn't ask anyone to read these, so I love that there's actually a wonderful link in all of them. And I think from especially yours, Alistair and Nick, this question of belonging, I think even in yours, Karen, which is a big theme, I think, in all 3 of the books. The city as a place that people are constantly negotiating. And maybe I want to start just a step before we get into the story. For yourselves, what is your relationship with the cities that you write about, and how did that shape the way in which you characterize the cities? Let's start here, but we're not going in a row.
Well, I very much am a Capetonian. I was born and bred in Cape Town, went to Wynberg Girls, and always lived in the same house in Plumstead, and now I live in Deep River. And that's what I know. I guess a large part of identity is linked to place and where you feel comfortable and safe. And so a lot of that is, for me, the southern suburbs. I think from my parents, I learned a fear of this side of town, actual town, because, it would be such a mission to go there because the traffic would be bad and there's nowhere to park. And so even now, I'm like, oh my God, going to town, this is terrifying. And, you have to pack provisions and...
It's an excursion.
So for me, I really had to set my novel in the southern suburbs to locate it there in terms of my own understanding, and also that sense of kind of on the outskirts that Deirdre feels of not quite belonging and being outside of time and place in a sense.
My favorite thing about Capetonians when I moved here, they have not so much, there's a weird sense of space and time. So here far is 15 minutes away. In Joburg, 15 minutes is like 30 minutes. If anything's beyond 30 minutes, then we start thinking, but if anything is an hour, then we're like, okay, it's far. But in Joburg, 20 minutes is far. If I'm traveling for more than 30 minutes, it's very far. So I love that you said that, because there's these imaginary lines in the city that that create the sense of smallness, but also how to negotiate the city. Seeing as you're also writing about Cape Town, do you want to come in?
Yeah, sure. So I have an interesting relationship with Cape Town, as does the main character in this book. I think because I grew up in Joburg, which is a very different city, Cape Town has a brand. It has like an aura, you know. And I always imagined moving to Cape Town when I was a kid, and it seemed like this idyllic, beautiful place. It's got beautiful beaches. It's got beautiful mountains. I thought it had better race, figured out the race stuff. It was more like racially mixed. No, as a kid, I thought this is the brand that Cape Town had at the time.
Got it.
And I was like, it's more open-minded and you can be gay in public and nobody cares. So it was almost like this utopia that I was fantasizing about growing up. And then you move here and you realize it's a very complicated place. And in some ways it's quite hellish for a lot of people. And it's got a lot of hasn't really addressed its spatial apartheid, and like there's a lot of problems with Cape Town. So I find it quite a fun and rewarding city to write about because it does have those two very extreme differences in it. Yeah.
And as the lone kind of Joburger, it wasn't deliberate.
Yeah. Now, the thing about me, okay, let me just say that, okay, I was born in Joburg, but I studied also in Cape Town. So, and I travel a lot. I live in Berlin at the moment. But I want to, the idea of the city to me was quite different, you know, I think, because I was born in Soweto, which was more like an insulated kind of space. So, like, for instance, my mother remembers the time, okay, when she was still alive, for instance, what she used to say is that before I went to Wits, she still thought of Johannesburg as that, as this specific place is a white space, whereby, because she lived around the time when there was Section 10 of the influx control, you know, whereby at 11 o'clock, if they find you without carrying, a paper to say, my employer held me until this time, you were arrested. So every time that I'm always in the city, she still lived around that time. So every time I go to the city, just before, what I remember about her is that, there will be, she says I have to call her around 10 to 10, just to comment, just to say that I'm safe, because the police might arrest me, because she still lived around that time. So it was, Joburg as in a city center used to be a space whereby it was designated only for white people for them. So come 1994, I'm saying this because in Soweto, for instance, which is about almost 15 kilometers to Johannesburg, you still find people that have never been to a city, old people that have never been to a city, but they can point at it, you know, and say, that's there. But what are we going to do there? You know, so that shifting space of the city for me was very much interesting, because also when I went to Wits University in 1994, which was suddenly the floodgates opened. You can come as well, you know, into this space that used to be a white space, and is this so the city became it's constantly shifting. So that's what interested me, and mostly when the book came out, for instance, I'm also a travel writer. I get asked by different publications to write about this specific city that is changing at the moment, and I felt like, when you write something that is commissioned, you are told actually to write about gentrification. Don't focus on the racial lines, or even the invasion of Johannesburg. Just focus on the invasion by the foreigners and whatever. You know, you are told what to write about. So I realized that I know this city. It's not like what they're asking me to write about it, you know. So let me rather write a city as I know it. Though it's fiction, it's not fiction. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm so glad you're making that point, because I think all three of you are talking about these imaginary lines in cities. There are no actual walls, even though we've kind of historically we come from, and actually presently, where walls separate people. But there's something about the cities you write about where there are these imaginary lines that people put for themselves. And walking is then the thing that enables them to break those walls. I mean, just maybe going back to these extracts, if you could speak more about just like the embodiment that you wanted to capture, because there's so much of the body and being in the city, both the characters, but also the characters that they then engage with. I mean, the extracts, the homelessness. We can't write about the city without writing about homelessness. So maybe say a bit more about the body and the way that you kind of imagined how these bodies are moving around in the city.
Well, in my novel, Deirdre, she lost one of her legs when she was 18 in 1994, just prior to the first free and fair elections. And so she's crippled, calls herself a cripple, and she walks on crutches. She never wanted a prosthetic leg. And it's kind of an unsubtle metaphor for how certain white people might consider themselves having been crippled or handicapped by the changes that came in 1994, that there is no space for them in the new South Africa, that they don't want to be part of it, or because they feel that they're not wanted, they don't participate. There's no sense of community from them. And so she's full of bitterness and rage and selfishness. She does nothing for anyone ever. She's always trying to get from everyone. And so in that sense, her body is really a metaphor for that type of person or personality. That's not to say that she's only a terrible person, because she really is terrible. If you read the book, she's pretty horrific.
You're dead.
Yeah.
But you know, she's also very broken and fractured in various ways.
Alistair, do you want to come in?
Yeah, sure. So that's an interesting question. I think my character is almost the opposite extreme of a character who's trying so desperately to connect across the sort of historical divides. And he grew up in a way in which he felt like the middle class South Africans just isolate themselves and hide behind high walls and drive everywhere and don't try and interact with the city around him. So he constantly puts himself in situations where he doesn't feel safe, and he walks in places where most people wouldn't consider it safe to walk, in an effort to sort of feel integrated and to feel like he belongs in the city. But it does have consequences for his bodily person. He is attacked at one point, and he's in another altercation at various points in the book. But he's desperately trying to feel a sense of connectedness to the fellow city residents, I suppose. And even in trying to do that, he also is terrible in many ways. So it's hard, even when you're trying to reach across historical divides or try to mend things. Often your actions have unintended consequences.
May I ask a question? Yes.
Yeah.
How much personal research did you do did you put yourself in dangerous situations, go and wait for someone to mug you or something? Yeah.
I wish I had that kind of courage. No, I mean the sort of baby versions of it, but no, not the more extreme versions of it. Yeah. We can put all of the traits that we wish we had in our characters.
Yes,
right?
of course. No, I was just wondering how committed you are, because that's not to say.
Autoethnographic.
So I didn't amputate my leg.
No need for that.
No, I was just, because I think that it would be stupid to
do that. So Nick, did you end up sleeping in a cemetery? Because Mangi at some point sleeps in a cemetery. How do you relate with the body?
No, actually, the idea of symmetry. So my main character is called Mangi. Is a guy that is in a committed relationship for 7 years with his girlfriend, and then he finds that she lied on certain things that were important to them. So this relationship, it breaks down. So he is forced to move out of the house, but they're living in the suburbs, so they're forced to move out. So one of the places that she's talking about, that she's asking about, is the cemetery, because he goes and sleep there. In that, first of all, when I was writing this character, I think the main recurring theme was a theme of home instead of homelessness. Because there are places, certain places that we consider a home, and in actual fact, they are just a house. It's just a house, it's not a home. Because when you think about a home, you think about, a place where there's cordial relationship, everybody, there's love, there's everything. So here, there's no longer love. Where the Mangi goes into different phases of home, discovers 3 homes. Firstly, he sleeps in his car, which becomes his home. He sleeps under the bridge with the homeless, which becomes his home. And he sleeps in the cemetery, which becomes his home. But what is more interesting when I was writing this particular section of chapter of the cemetery is that the cemetery is just next to Wits University. Remember, I studied at Wits University. Every time when I come out of the, around the university, on the gate, that's the cemetery, the Braamfontein Park. I didn't know that it had history. For me, for instance, it was a place where old dying professors were buried. So, because it was just next to the university. I didn't know that it carried this kind of history in it. And it carries also the history of division of South Africans, For instance, it's in history, I studied during apartheid, in high school. We were forced to do history. Who is the founder of Johannesburg? And then you memorize those kind. Heinrich whoever. And I realized that is the cemetery where most of them are buried. And that cemetery itself, it's also a place of division, Because remember, it's a huge cemetery. The only black person that is buried there is Enoch Sotonga, because he composed the national anthem anyway, So the others are, so this divisions, there's an Indian section, a white section, Enoch Sotonga there,
The exceptional.
Yeah, and then all this, but at the moment, it's a center of neglect, because these graves are sinking. So I became interested in that. Every time I pass, because there's a hangout place when I'm in Joburg, Melville. I think some of you take a taxi. Yeah, exactly, Sia. So I go past there every time the taxi passes there, and I look at it and I see, on tombstones, homeless people have washed their clothes and then put them there, Yeah. And then I realized that's somebody's home. Yeah. So a home, whenever they send you to a grave, we don't even rest even in the grave, because we're still harassed even there. And there are still divisions. Yeah. So that was my interest of the city itself, that it's in constant motion and it's complex, and you can never really pin it down and say this is the city, and we should allow it to evolve. Maybe as it evolves, homelessness is part of its evolution. So maybe other things are going to come out. Gentrification is part of it. Maybe later on there will be other things that will come out. So that's how I was conceiving the book to write about.
This question of home and homelessness, and the cemetery, and obviously it's a place of dead people, but there's a whole other community in the way that you're describing it. But I feel like this conversation is getting us towards closer and closer, just like home and homelessness, so we're just going to sit there. And you do something really interesting with home and homelessness, because, and I don't want to give too much away, but Deirdre and the community that she's in, they no longer live in their home. They were moved from their home by the government, and they now live in like these kind of makeshift flats, apartments, I guess. Yeah. What's going on there? But the home is still within reach, and her mother also lives across the road from her, but never goes and visits her mother. That was just such an interesting sort of, I keep doing triangle, but like a relationship of movement, but also of home, And this home that she cannot go back to lives very much within the home that she's in. And it's obviously not a home. She lives in a room, basically.
Yeah, so because of the water shortage, there have been, in my novel, there have been instances where the government, if they find water, underground water, then they remove people from their homes so that they can access that water, and then they promise to give people homes, but that's a very long wait, and so in the meantime they're put in basically what you would think of as like a retirement village, but it would be, you know, a family of 4 with babies and children stuck in just a room with a bathroom. And while they wait and wait and wait for their money to get their house, their next house. And this house that was taken from Deirdre, it is where she grew up. It's a house that her dad put a lot of work into, but you also discover that it was a house that was taken from a colored family when they were made to move out of that region. And so when certain things are found after the house is destroyed, found in the ground, she says, well, it was them, it was the colored family, it wasn't us, it's got nothing to do with us, go look for them, go find them. And she can't get away from that house. That house is her mother, her father, her adopted daughter, it is her lost leg, her brother, everything that she wants to forget but almost revels in remembering in her bitterness. And the fact that her mother is in a special care unit across the road, she never goes to see her because there is that love-hate relationship with her mother. She hates her mother. She never cared for her properly because her mother, she feels, never cared for her properly. But, you know, there is always, as in any relationship, I think when love is withheld, that's when you want it the most. And so she's holding on to this past in which she wishes it could change, where she could have everything that she hasn't had. And I always forget this, that the book actually has different parts in it. So most of it is told from Deirdre's point of view, but then there are some sections told from Trudy, that's her mother, from her point of view. And then you can see, you can almost see why Deirdre is the way she is, because her mother's pretty terrible as well. They're all pretty terrible. Yet you can't help feeling sorry for all of them, I think. Did you feel sorry?
I felt sorry for them, even though I was shook and angry, and I had so many emotions. Gosh. Anyway, yeah.
Well, I think that was the idea, that
Yes.
you should come away from the book feeling pretty awful.
Yeah.
No, I mean, mission accomplished. Like I said, Deirdre's cough and is like very much here, and just there's also just like the way in which her room is so unkempt, and there's another character, Miriam, who I think is a neighbor, who's constantly trying to like just clean up after yourself. Look up, but you can smell the room that. Oh gosh. Anyway, let's talk about nice things. You talk about a forever home, Alistair, and I love that expression because I also feel like it's such a privileged thing to have and to want and to you know, I mean, it's part of this home that there's a certainty of home, and you can kind of see this longevity to this place. And maybe just speak about the choices that you made with that. Why?
Sure. So
and it's a great contrast, by the way, with this not forever home.
So the character in this book he bought this thing with this home which he wanted to be his forever home where he could raise a family, and then he spends a few years in the US, and when he returns back he finds that concept quite hard to grasp again. He's again feeling rootless. He'd spent a lot of his life feeling rootless. He doesn't live in the same city as any of his family members. So he's also on a mission to try and find a sense of home and belonging. At one point he goes back to Joburg, which is where he grew up, to try and connect with his father. So in this novel, the main character and his husband are adopting a baby, and that throws up a whole lot of stuff for them in terms of his own childhood and his relationship with his own father, who passed away just before the book begins. And he's trying to be a better father than he had. But in that, he's trying to better understand his father, and he tries to look for the sort of the family home that they grew up in, but it's not there. He makes a comment about Joburg is no place for a forever home. It's no place for an ancestral home because it's always changing so much. There's new developments everywhere. He tries to go back to the street where he grew up, and there's a townhouse complex on it now. And he also eventually ends up in a graveyard, trying desperately to find some sense of connection to a sense of home. But also, I think their mission to start a family is their way of, it's a much more personal sense of home, but is a way of trying to find a way to feel like you have a place where you are safe and you are held and you are loved.
I mean, there's so much, there's so much unresolved, and I think the background or backdrop of the city is part of what allows that. So much is unresolved about the characters and their relationships, where they feel a sense of belonging, and I think you do that so masterfully. I think no character I feel like I can completely hate.
Have you been to Maboneng?
Yes.
Is it dirty?
Yes.
Okay, I'll correct you. Okay. Have you been
It's
to
like-
Braamfontein? It's not dirty.
Okay.
Hi, thanks. I wanted to ask a question about inequality, because I think all of your books touch on inequality and privilege and how those things are completely relational. I mean, Alistair, you talk about your main characters having the sense of identity and belonging and home, but there's later on also a scene where the character is in Philippi somewhere, and he witnesses an eviction, a forced eviction from people from their shacks. And so that speaks to this kind of inequality and who has privilege and who has the ability to live in a home. And Karen, I think you touch on this as well, where your character is not necessarily privileged, but she is white, and she's almost holding on to a sense of victimhood.
Yes.
Which I think is just really an interesting kind of commentary on, I guess, privilege and inequality. And I think, Nick, you mentioned your characters have gone through all of these circumstances that put them in really, really difficult places.
Yeah.
So I wondered if you guys could just talk about how you write about inequality and how you set that up in relation to your stories and why it's important.
Yeah.
So for me, I don't really think you can set a book in South Africa and not tackle inequality. It's the most heartbreaking and pervasive thing about our society. And I suppose the classic novel is supposed to just follow, one person's perspective and one person's inner journey. And I wanted to explore a lot of inner stuff in this book, and it's a lot about mental health and anxiety and trying not to pass on the damage that we've inherited to the next generation. But in setting it in a city, I suppose you're confronted every day with inequality and the fact that people have lives completely different from your own. And so for me, it's really important to show both of those in a book, because if you're just telling the one side of that story, it feels like an incomplete picture of the city and of any kind of South African experience. Even as we do try, I think, to blind ourselves from it as much as we can. I think maybe a thing that literature can do can be to open our eyes again as to what's all around us.
Yeah, I would have to agree. It's impossible to write about South Africa without writing about inequality. And it's also, it's very difficult because there's so much pussyfooting around. Am I allowed to say that?
Yes. That's a great word. Say it again.
No, now I'm blushing. Around appropriation and who's allowed to say what, and when, if a white character looks at poor people and says, they're disgusting, then is that the author speaking? And then, are you going to get cancelled? And there's so much to worry about. And I think this is one of the ongoing things, that how can you address inequality or problems within a nation when you have to be worrying all the time whether it's going to offend someone. I don't mean that writers can write anything. I think that you have to approach everything with great care and be very circumspect, do your research, write with sensitivity, don't take something and make it your own if it's not your own. But I do think that there has to be a space, and writing has always been that space, where we are able to talk about these things and hold a mirror up to society and say, look, this is something that's going on. You know, I just this morning taking an Uber in here, firstly taking an Uber, you know. I used to take taxis all the time, not fancy taxis, like minibus taxis, but I guess since coming back to South Africa and with COVID and everything, I've become afraid of it. So, you know, I Ubered here, that's privilege by itself, and then coming in and seeing how many people are living in absolute squalor outside the castle. And you look at, I get quite emotional because you look at this history of South Africa right there, the castle that is still standing all these years later. It was built by people who were, most of the people that worked for the VOC, they were, you know, sort of scoundrels that really couldn't make it in Europe, so they came out to South Africa. And it's not like they lived a luxury life. They were most of the time starving and had to eat penguins, and it was terrible. But you can't get away from the fact, okay, you had to eat penguins, but you also, you know, decimated hundreds and thousands of people's lives and their culture and heritage and all that. But so there's I'm getting carried away, and I'm not sure what my point is. But
Inequality,
right.
but it's historical. You're still there.
So we can't escape it. It has to be part of our conversations, as much as voting and holding our government to the promises that it has made and made and made and made and made, and that it needs to be looking after its people. All right, the end.
I think with me, I write about it all the time, you know. It's part of my DNA to write about such kind of, important matters in our, of our society. That's why it makes me feel happy in most cases when I write about, more especially, as black people, sometimes, in most cases, we are typecast. So if there's a thief somewhere, I'll give you a story. Sometime I went to Berlin, and then I'm talking in a bar, and then the following day I go to that bar, and then it's broken into, and I'm from South Africa. And I always feel guilty that, the world knows South Africans as, hey, it's a place of criminals, So that's why it makes me feel happy in most cases when I write my characters, if I make them, if they are white, to be thieves. So I do that quite a lot, and I do it deliberately. You read my this new book, for instance. It's got two people who are white, Afrikaner for that matter, who go to KFC every time and say, we are from the Bureau of Standards.
So dodgy.
So they've been eating this KFC every day. When they're hungry, they go there, and then they go with the blacks. Imagine if it was a black person going in the KFC and say, I'm from the Bureau of Standards. Of course, there will be lots of questions. So these people are thieves, and they are white, and I'm happy.
And they get away with it. Last question.
Thanks, Karen. My favorite word is pussyfooting, so I'm glad someone said it. I find it. I've had a very similar experience, all of you guys, of being very interested in South African cities, but also living abroad and also having that experience. And I think there is that deep urge in South Africans to leave and see another perspective and so forth. But my personal experience is like a deep kind of disgust in other cities outside of South Africa at like the basic hypocrisy and the basic kind of like single narrative of those cities. Like if you go to Berlin, if you live in London like I have, you see this deep sense that they have pushed away and that there is so much recording of history everywhere, but there's also just, they have the means, the wealth, everything to build a more complex narrative of their cities. And their current policies in all those cities is to deny and to pay lip service to those histories instead of actually integrating them to their sense of themselves. So my feeling back in South Africa is like, obviously aware of the deep hypocrisy and the deep problems of cities, but we have an opportunity because of like just the standard of who we are, like, and our history, to address those things in a way that I feel is lost and impossible for so many other cities in the global north, you know. Anyway, my point is, like, what has your experience in other cities done for your understanding of South African cities from that?
Well, I lived in Brazil, so it's not exactly like, not that different, although, so most of the time we lived in a sort of a rural part of a rural capital, so it was a lot of, it's in a part of the country where slaves didn't really come to. So we didn't see many people of color or mixed race. My ex-husband is of Angolan descent mixed with various other things. So he was quite dark-skinned compared to others who were quite light-skinned. So he sort of stood out. But what we did find, though, is that there is definitely still that racism around people of darker color. You know, slavery only ended in Brazil in the late 1880s. It was the last place to end slavery. So there's still very strong slave mindsets in terms of the enslavers and the enslaved, and that if you are a person of color, you are supposed to be in a position of a servile position. And that's much more clear in Sao Paulo, where we also spent some time, where the immensely wealthy, the traffic is so bad in Sao Paulo that they don't bother with cars. They have private helicopters to fly them around so they can beat the traffic. Whereas then you have the favelas and you have people just living on the streets. I once saw a man literally, this is quite disgusting if you don't mind, literally washing his armpits with his own spit. And I thought, how does it come to this? How does a country come to this where people are riding in fucking helicopters above your head? And then there's also the black helicopters of the police with their guns flying around, because you're all considered drug dealers and gangsters and stuff, so they're flying around ready to shoot you. And here's a man washing his armpits with his own spit. And you know, you could have, except for the helicopters, you could have seen that scenario in South Africa on any day.
No,
You want to add?
Oh, you can.
Sure. So my experiences of New York were quite mixed. I think it's difficult to distill into an answer. Actually, it's a really great question, because America has a lot of similar issues to South Africa, actually, especially along race lines, and the history is just as terrible, and it's got pretty bad inequality. But I suppose the things that struck me about New York when I first arrived was how much indigenous, like Native American culture is just being eviscerated. There's just nothing left of it on East Coast America, really. And poverty, I think, is still racialized, but there are some interesting things which I think South African cities could learn from in terms of, like the subway, if I remember correctly, it's the same price no matter where you're traveling on the network, so that then helps people who are living further out. They've also got housing projects throughout the city, which is great, and Seapoint could learn a thing or two about that. Not always just trying to push poverty to the outskirts of the city. Yeah, it was nice. I mean, that passage I read earlier, I suppose you can see the stuff more clearly when you don't feel so enmeshed in it almost. I think the benefit of leaving South Africa and of seeing a city that's not a city that you have any particular connection to is that you see the social dynamics and then you can transfer that back home and you see it all more clearly too.
So obviously an hour is not enough for this wonderful book.
Is there not time for Nick to quickly
No,
give
no,
a quick answer?
it's fine. I think
Your
I've
mouth
said
was open.
Okay,
it's
Nick.
always like that when I breathe.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Since you say I must say something, I live in a city that is constantly trying hard to hide poverty. You know, it's and that is always in has to regulate migration. You know, so there are migrants being sent over here and sent over there. It's very. That's why they say, of course, the saying goes that Berlin belongs to everyone except the Germans. So it really shows that the city is the city that is really evolving, but it's got its own problems of migration and homelessness. Because homelessness is not just a South African thing. It's happening everywhere in the world. Perhaps we should just accept that this is what is happening in the world. But certain governments have got a way of dealing with that, you know, because, I mean, if you are Chancellor of Germany, for instance, is too small, it's the size of Cape Town. So it's easier sometimes. I'm just thinking that some of the things are easier to regulate. I'm not talking in terms of population, but in terms of the size of the country itself, you know. And they've got other countries that are doing well. So South Africa, for instance, is surrounded by equally poor countries. You know, we all want to come to this same pot, you know. So whereas in Europe, it's easier because you can go to Paris, you can go to Belgium, you can go to different cities around it. And it's easier to, as you said, they have this good system of traveling. So it's easier. If they chase you out of this bridge here, you can go to the next one in Paris. You know, go to the next one elsewhere, unlike here. So that's my experience of the, you know, of the cities. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And we're almost on time, almost. But thank you for a wonderful conversation. And thank you all for coming. And thank you for the commentary. And buy the books, get them signed, read them.